This is Criteria.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Criteria. I'm Thomas Miras, and I'm here with my co-host from afar, James Majewski. Hey, James.
Hey, Thomas. Good to be back.
And today we are returning to the genre of film noir, which we introduced with our recent episode on Out of the Past. Today we'll be discussing one of my favorite noirs, one of my favorite movies in general, I'd say, Sweet Smell of Success from 1957, directed by Alexander McKendrick and starring Tony Curtis and Burt Lancaster. Tony Curtis as a press agent, that is a publicity man who sells items to columnists, and Burt Lancaster as his not his main squeeze columnist, but the columnist who mainly squeezes him in a bad way for various dirty dealings that he doesn't want to do himself. And I describe this movie as being sort of the, I've said this to you multiple times, James, but being like sort of about the dynamic between Wormtongue and Saruman. if you sympathized a little bit with Wormtongue and they were like playing against each other. Now that you've seen it, does that sound at all?
Yeah,
sensible?
although I do think that the relationship between Tony Curtis's character and Burt Lancaster's character in this is a little more equal. I think that there's a little more parity between the two than the description of Saruman and Wormtongue suggests.
Okay.
Because even though Tony Curtis's character is a clear lackey to Burt Lancaster's character, there are still these interesting times when he chooses to push back. What's his name? Sidney and JJ. So if Sidney is the Wormtongue and JJ is the Saruman, there are times when Sidney throws his weight around a little bit too.
Yeah,
and
that's
so
true.
it's very interesting. And also, he describes JJ several times as a friend or as a best friend, and you don't get the impression that this is just pure self-delusion, because he says it to JJ's sister even, and that's sort of accepted. So there's like a closeness between the two of them from the first scene when we're introduced. Clearly there's this power dynamic where JJ wields the most power for sure.
Okay, well, I'm going to go ahead and, if it's okay, I'm going to go ahead and play a clip of that scene that you just mentioned to whet people's appetite.
Are you an actor, Mr. Falco?
That's what I was thinking. Are you, Mr. Falco?
Well, how did you guess it, Miss James?
He's so pretty, that's how.
Mr. Falco, let it be said at once, is a man of 40 faces, not one. None too pretty, and all deceptive. You see that grin? That's the charming street urchin face. It's part of his helpless act. He throws himself upon your mercy. He's got a half dozen faces for the ladies. But the one I like, the really cute one, is the quick, dependable chap. Nothing he won't do for you in a pinch. So he says. Mr. Falco, whom I did not invite to sit at this table tonight, is a hungry press agent and fully up to all the tricks of his very slimy trade. Match me, Sidney.
Not right this minute, JJ.
I know that wonder boy of yours opens at the Latin Quarter next week.
JJ,
Say goodbye, Lester.
May I ask you a naive question, Mr. Falco? Exactly how does a press agent work?
Well, answer the man, Sidney. He's trying to take you off the hook.
you just saw a good example of it, Senator. A press agent eats a columnist dirt and is expected to call it manna.
But don't you help columnists by furnishing them with items?
Sure. A columnist can't do without us, except our good and great friend J.J. forgets to mention that. You see, we furnish him with items.
What, some cheap, gruesome gags?
You print them, don't you?
Yes, with your clients' names attached. That's the only reason the poor slobs pay you, to see their names in my column all over the world. Now I make it out you're doing me a favor?
I didn't say
The day I can't get along without a press agent's handouts, I'll close up shop and move to Alaska lock, stock, and barrel.
Sweep out my igloo. Here I come.
Look, Manny, you rode in here on the senator's shirt tail, so shut your mouth.
Now come, J.J. That's a little too harsh. Anyone seems fair game for you tonight?
This man is not for you, Harvey. And you shouldn't be seen in public with him, because that's another part of a press agent's life. They dig up scandal about prominent people and shovel it thin among columnists who give them space.
There seems to be some illusion here that escapes me.
We're friends, Harvey. We go as far back as when you were a fresh kid congressman, don't we?
Why is it that everything you say sounds like a threat?
Maybe it's a mannerism, because I don't threaten friends. But why furnish your enemies with ammunition? You're a family man, Harvey, and someday, God willing, you may want to be president. And here you are, out in the open, where any hep person knows that this one is toting that one around for you. Are we kids or what? Next time you come up, you might join me on my TV show.
Thanks, J.J., for what I consider sound advice.
Go thou and sin no more.
Senator?
Night, Mr. Falco.
One of the things I really like about that scene is how it frames the two of them together and how they share the space within the frame. It's a very tight shot, but you get both of them sort of packed in there, and it really betrays a kind of familiarity, a kind of closeness that in the scene itself they're not necessarily acknowledging. But it's sort of it identifies the two of them right away visually. I hope.
Alexander McKendrick, the director, we have him, of course, to credit for this movie, but also specifically the way that scene is laid out. Would you call it blocking when they're sitting down? Is it still blocking?
Yeah, or like the mise en scène, or something like
so,
that. You know?
So apparently, Burt Lancaster, who plays the columnist JJ, who's a producer on the film as well, or at least his production company that he was a part of produced the film. He fought against having Sidney Falco, this character, sit next to him in this scene. They were originally going to be sitting side by side. He was going to sort of like slide up next to him, and he fought against this. He was arguing that, JJ wouldn't slide over for this guy, and maybe also didn't want to turn his star entrance into like a two-shot, right? So this is according to Gary Giddens, the film critic Gary Giddens, commenting on the film. So McKendrick, he stood firm on it, but instead of having them sit right next to each other, he had Curtis grab a chair rather than squeeze onto the bench. And so this creates this sequence where Hunsecker is, I'm just going to quote Giddens because the way he describes it, created a skillful sequence of bank shot dialogue in which Hunsecker aims lines at the guests before him that ricochet into Sidney's face, which manages to convey charm to the guests and anxiety to us. And this is something I've noticed throughout the movie, is the way that Sidney sort of anxiously watches the backs of people's heads at various times in the movie. There's just always something going on his face, which is part of the fun of the film.
Another really great thing that I'll just say about this scene before we give, I guess, a better synopsis of the film and maybe touch on a few more things about the genre. But that this scene is just such a great example of how the exposition in this film is handled so deftly. We get so much information in this scene, so much information about these characters, about their relationship to one another, about sort of what's going on in this film. So much character development unfolds, but it's all sort of baked in very naturally into this power struggle that's emerging between the two of them in the presence of this sort of third party, the senator and his mistress and her manager. I feel like, so many other less masterfully handled or crafted scenes would just sort of relay this information, and it would be really dull and it would be really obvious. But here it's almost like you don't even realize that you're learning like who these people are and what this world is and what the stakes are in their relationship. It's all handled so naturally, so organically, and it's rooted in like what these characters are doing to one another and the actions that they're playing on and against each other.
Yeah.
So it's really, really great scene.
Yeah, it's also cool because, you know, Hunsecker hasn't actually appeared in the film yet, but his shadow has been over the first 20 minutes or so of the film because right at the beginning we see his eyes on the side of this truck that's delivering newspapers to carry his column, and he's just, you know. Yeah. Well, that's our teaser, I guess, of the film. But I wanted to make a couple of callbacks to our previous noir discussion, James, just to tie up some loose ends, because there was something you said, first of all, about part of the appeal of noir in this post-war era. This movie's 1957, so what, almost 10 years after? Something like 10 years after Out of the Past, which we discussed last time. But you said something about this broken, this already breaking down relationship between men and women. And I just had a thought coming after that, which is that Out of the Past kind of begins with Adam taking the apple that Eve offers him, you know? And then at the end, it ends with him doing what he should have done, which is turning Eve into the authorities, so to speak, even at a cost to himself.
That's fun.
So that was my thought.
Nice
about that comment that you made. I've also been, since our last discussion, reading this Thomas Hibbs book. Thomas Hibbs is a Catholic philosopher. He's at Baylor University and was recently the president of the University of Dallas for a time. And he wrote a book years back about film noir titled Arts of Darkness. And so I've read part of it so far, and he has a couple of interesting points. And one of them, I think, sort of validates a point that you made last time about contrasting noir with like a traditional detective story, where you said the plot is less important, the details of the plot are less important. And so just to validate your point, you know, Hibbs cites a critic named John Irwin who says that noir revises the traditional detective story, which is principally an intellectual puzzle to be solved by the detective, whereas noir turns the mystery into one of character rather than plot. And then he also cites another critic, John Coelty, and I thought this was super interesting. And this guy says, unlike the classical detached detective, you know, your Sherlock Holmes as the sort of like the epitome of that, the hard-boiled detective must take a moral stance towards those around him. And Hibbs says, because this is coming in the course of his discussion of the movie The Maltese Falcon, Hibbs says, the case is not solved for Spade until he has made a moral appraisal of those implicated. Which I thought was pretty fascinating. Now, this movie we're discussing today is a detective movie, and neither was I guess the previous one was. But you know, that's very interesting in itself, you know, and that's clearly the case in a lot of noir movies.
Yeah, definitely, for sure. And I'm glad that we're talking about this movie for a few reasons, but one of them being that its main character is not a detective.
Right.
Nevertheless, we have him doing sort of very detective-y things.
Yes, totally.
So maybe this is a good time to just give like a quick synopsis about what the film's about. Do you want to do it, or should I?
Well, I think basically we can say in a simple way, it's about this press agent, Sidney Falco, played by Tony Curtis, and this was his kind of, he had some roles as a kind of a teeny bopper, you know, like a kind of a pretty boy. And people were actually upset. His fans were kind of upset by him being so repugnant in this movie, you know?
That's awesome.
So, but this was his kind of critical breakout success. And he is working for a number of people, but mainly for this guy, J.J. Hunsecker, this very powerful, essentially you would call him a columnist, a gossip columnist maybe, but more than just that. He's clearly a powerful...
And I had no idea... I really didn't know that these gossip columnists were such a cultural institution in their day. I guess apparently this character is based off of a real figure.
He's clearly more than that because he's talking on his TV show about democracy and stuff. But gossip is definitely a part of his trade. We talked about these gossip columnists when we discussed Hail Caesar too.
Right.
But this character, J.J. Hunsecker, is based on a real guy named Walter Winchell. So Winchell had apparently sort of like an obsession with his daughter in such a way that he I forget exactly what he did, but he basically drove her boyfriend into hiding essentially somehow. Wow. I forget the details. Wow. And then I can't remember if maybe he tried to have his daughter institutionalized after that for a period of time. Or this in this story, J.J. Hunsecker has a younger sister, considerably younger than him, and he's basically middle aged. And she's 19. Yeah. And they're all, they don't have any other family in the world, it appears. And he is upset that she's in a close relationship with this young jazz guitarist, a guy named Steve Dallas. And I'm sorry, the sister's name is Susie. And so he's basically tasked his minion, Sidney Falco, to break up this relationship by whatever means necessary in a way that doesn't lead back to him, so that he can still keep his relationship with his now growing to be an adult sister, as he says, at par, which is kind of a funny way of at least at par, I think is how he puts it.
A sustainable relationship.
So basically, this movie, that the protagonist is really Sidney Falco, and he is being pushed into a corner by JJ, trying to get him to do dirty work that's a little too dirty even for him, in terms of and the central sort of scheme is that they're planting a marijuana cigarette onto into this guy's overcoat, so that he'll be arrested and he'll be his band will be fired and from their club gig. And this is kind of true to life too, because there was an association of jazz musicians with drugs, and at a time there was in the 40s, earlier than this, there was this whole cabaret card system where if you got in trouble, you would lose your cabaret card and not be able to gig potentially for years. This happened to Charlie Parker at one point. And also apparently somebody actually planted weed on Gene Krupa in 1943 to try to ruin him. Wow. The great jazz drummer. Wow. So anyway, so a lot of real world references in this, and it's recreating this very, real world Times Square of 1957, with all the crowds and the chaos, and they really did film in these locations, and they had to deal with just crowds running through, and legions of Tony Curtis fans trying to break through the police barriers at various times, but they got this really real gritty nighttime New York City.
It's great.
Yeah, James Wong Howe, who was the cinematographer on this film. He is one of the most influential cinematographers ever. He was on over 130 films, and he was also, I think, I think he was the first Asian. He was Chinese born. He was the first Asian to be in the American Society of Cinematographers, I think. Anyway, he was known as a master of the use of shadow, one of the first people to use deep focus cinematography successfully, which means that basically what's in the background is as much in focus as what's in the foreground. Right. And he also pioneered the use of wide angle lenses, low key lighting, which we talked about last time as a fundamental staple of the noir look. And the use of the crab dolly for smooth tracking shots. And in this film, he worked with the director Alexander McKendrick to give this film kind of a sharp-edged look that was reminiscent of New York tabloid photography of the time, and such as this guy Ouija. His nickname was Ouija, and I looked at this guy's photographs, and there is definitely a resemblance. This guy Ouija was kind of one of the first sort of celebrity street photographers. He would photograph people looking at murder scenes, and people making out in movie theaters, and sort of slightly degenerate, but some of the images are pretty fascinating.
Well, New York City is slightly degenerate. There's this great line that we get from JJ early on. He sees some guy getting thrown out of a club, and he says, I love this dirty town. And, I find that deeply sympathetic. That was one of the things I really enjoyed about this film is that, it really feels like New York City. Sometimes films take place in New York and, you might get like a few token shots, but then otherwise it's a lot of sort of, generic interiors or studio shots or, especially given the time when this film was made, I just wasn't sure to what extent it was going to really have like a New York City feel. And this is in contrast to a film like Out of the Past, which is all California and California wilderness and Tahoe, but man, it's like from the beginning, it's nailed down. The city lights, the traffic, the pedestrians, the tight spaces.
You get a few minutes of that,
that
dark traffic and this newspaper truck moving through the streets and this great jazz score by Elmer Bernstein setting the atmosphere.
Oh man, the music is phenomenal.
So there's Elmer Bernstein's music, which is great, but there's also the music of the actual jazz group featured in the film.
Chico Hamilton.
This was
Quintet.
a working band of the time. Chico Hamilton is a pretty well-known jazz musician even today, and not alive, but he's known today. And they basically just plugged in Martin Milner, the actor, to play the guitarist. But this is a working band, and those guys are in the movie. So we also get their music.
Yeah, well, and it really helps. Yeah, I mean, the music is great, but also seeing the musicians on stage so often, like, music is so much a part of this film, more than just having to do with a musician. It's like jazz is like, it's a character in this film. And it also goes a long way toward what I was talking about before about just sort of like the authentic feel of these New York City streets.
Right.
Moving from like the crowded diner where Sidney has just picked up the paper to like read the column and drink a coffee into, a tight nightclub, where people are like, in spitting distance of the musicians and
right. And even just like the lack of boundary between that cafe, that diner and the street, he's like walking in and out while his food's still there on the counter.
Yeah. And the camera follows him.
Very true to life. Yeah. And, I also really like the contrast between the two, the sort of two scores of this film, and that like the Elmer Bernstein score and it's jazzy, but it's more of like that cinematic jazz style and that sort of gritty and the dissonances and stuff. And then the actual jazz by this working jazz group is generally much more, I mean, it's very cool and hip, but it's like much more elegant and sort of chamber music-y.
Sure.
And then its sort of emotional character, it's actually a contrast with the...
It is, yeah.
So the jazz score of Elmer Bernstein is much more, the Tony Curtis and the Burt Lancaster world, but this sort of we get this actually kind of like wholesome jazz world for the actual jazz musicians in the film, which
that's a nice observation.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so I thought that that was something that was really well done.
But this movie's title is about, it's the sweet smell of success, and it's about where this guy, what these guys are seeking for and what Sidney's looking for. There's this conversation early on where Sidney is talking to his secretary Sally in his office / apartment, and he's like, basically saying JJ's going to get me, working for him is going to get me where I want to get to, and she's like, you make a living, what do you want to get? And I'm just going to play the clip here.
And Hunsecker is the golden ladder to the places I want to get.
Sidney, you make a living. Where do you want to get?
Way up high, Sam, where it's always balmy. Where no one snaps his fingers and says, hey, shrimp, rack the balls. Or, hey, Mouse, go out and buy me a pack of butts. I don't want tips from the kitty. I'm in the big game with the big players. My experience I can give you in a nutshell, and I didn't dream it in a dream either. Dog eat dog. In brief, from now on, the best of everything is good enough for me.
Sidney, I'm not trying to tell you what to do. It's just that it makes me feel bad when Mr. Hunsecker hurts you.
Every dog will have his day. That's for me, tear it up.
So it's him seeking success, which is this kind of like, it's these platitudes. It's a dog eat dog world. The best of everything is good enough for me.
Good enough for me.
These cliches and he's being pushed to do things that are increasingly sleazy. Certainly it's not new for him, but he's getting pushed increasingly out of even his moral comfort zone to do it. It's interesting. This is a film where the two main characters, and certainly the most interesting characters, are not good guys. Now, I don't know if every protagonist who's not a good guy is technically an anti-hero. I suspect there's a difference. Like, I suspect an anti-hero is like a subset of such things.
But we literally have him saying, I'm not a hero. you know?
Because an anti-hero is a hero who's not a hero.
Yeah.
I don't know if Sidney Falco is a hero at all. I mean, I think one of the reasons it works is because because he's almost never successful.
Mm-hmm.
For the whole movie, he has like a win with this comedian, that he's trying to trick into using his, publicity services. But we see him just scrambling to get by, debasing himself and constantly getting humiliated. Like in that great scene where he tries to blackmail this columnist and it just totally blows up in his face. And he's trying to, and the columnist's wife ends up respecting him even more for like getting out ahead of it and confessing to him that he was fooling around with another girl. And she goes, "This is the first clean thing I've seen you do in years." and he's just standing there with egg on his face.
It's an interesting thing that we see because, like, of course, we're sort of arriving in this film like in media res. Like, we're already in the middle of this story,
right? Because
he's already let down JJ. He's promised JJ that he would break up this relationship, and he hasn't. And now he's suffering the consequences from it. JJ is like squeezing him dry.
He won't. In other words, he basically is not printing his items, his publicity items, which means he can't make a living by being paid by the people who are paying him to get JJ to write about them.
Right. And so, we learn a lot about this character by seeing the way others respond to him. And almost from the beginning, like right from the get-go, people are really kind of talking down to him. So we get this scene that we showed where, he's telling his secretary about how, he doesn't want to be like the guy who goes and gets the cigarettes, he doesn't want to be talked down to. But that's not like, hyperbole on his part. Like, he's constantly getting talked down to. People call him various animals. They call him like a poodle and a louse and a snake, and the cop calls him ice cream cheeks or something. The
boy with the ice cream face.
Yeah, and so it's like people don't have respect for this man. Even JJ's secretary, who clearly has like a very familiar working relationship with him and some affection for him, says quite plainly that like you basically have no self-respect, but he's
immersed in the theology of making a quick fast she says, "You're so immersed in the theology of making a fast buck."
And he seems quite self-satisfied with this. So I would actually like
as part of this image. He starts off. He has all these different faces, as in the scene we played earlier. JJ points out in this brilliant exposition of Sidney's character, and the face we first see him is sort of desperation and being upset that JJ is squeezing him. But then we have this scene between him and his secretary, who's clearly, in his eyes, the naive, girl. And he's playing the hard-boiled with her, and it's clearly that's a face that he also enjoys being. It's this self-image of being, I'm not a nice guy. I'm a hard-boiled guy.
This character reminded me a lot of Iago. I think that like, there's something like Shakespearean about him and about this story. It's a tragedy, for him at least.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that in the same way that we get this satisfaction of seeing Iago, who is just so like assuredly evil. He's so sort of like self-assuredly manipulative.
Mm-hmm.
there's really much like a similar dynamic going on here. You mentioned there are a couple of times where we get the sense where he's being pushed maybe a little outside of his comfort zone, but it's not clear to me that this is necessarily because of morals. It may be, and there might be a case to be made for that, but by and large, this guy is very sleazy, very manipulative, very deceptive, and doesn't need to be pushed too hard. He really just needs to be incentivized the right way, and JJ is kind of the master at incentivizing him.
Right.
But I think that there's like a satisfaction that we get as the viewers in seeing this, like this. Maybe satisfaction is the wrong word. Maybe it's more of a fascination with sort of just seeing this like very nakedly evil character, kind of like Richard III or something,
Yeah.
Now,
and seeing and we're seeing him get, pushed around and embarrassed and all this stuff, and nobody likes him, and there's a couple of people who can sort of tolerate him. Susie is sort of nice to him, and for a lot of the movie, and like you said, JJ's secretary clearly has an affection for him, and but also seeing him, there's also some of the enjoyment, admittedly, is just watching him try to get out of these situations. It's like watching him be resourceful, even if it fails. There's something about his like tenacity and that scrappiness that you sort of respect on some level.
I don't know. But it's interesting how the film sort of toes this line, because if on the one hand we sometimes find ourselves sympathizing with him, especially when he's getting kicked around so much, we just want this guy to like get a break. On the other hand, there are times when he really does something despicable, and we feel it. So like this cigarette girl, Rita, who clearly has a thing for him, how she basically gets used by him to just be like another pawn in a scheme that he's trying to work for JJ.
Yeah, and he basically prostitutes her, tricks her into prostituting herself.
Right, and this was another reason that I thought of Iago with this character, because I think that one of the things that Shakespeare explores in Othello is sort of like how evil works on people and how evil tempts, and the sort of, it's almost like a screw tape letters type thing where you're dissecting the sort of dynamics of sin and of temptation. And Iago is this sort of like this like demon tempter who's taking Othello down a dark path. We see Sidney very much doing the similar thing, sort of employing. He's sort of like this minor demon basically, and what's interesting is that we see how that's resisted at times. So like you already mentioned this scene with the press agent who basically rebukes him and with the truth, and sort of resists him solidly, and he has nowhere to go, and that just made me think about like the wisdom of the saints and of the scriptures all being like, as soon as you start to get tempted, you just like resist really strongly, and the devil will flee. But then at other times when Sidney is given an ear, so like Rita initially resists him very strongly, but then she enters into a back and forth with him, and he's able to basically work on her. He starts throwing a lot of things until he finds something that sticks, and then he gets in there,
and she's already vulnerable because she has a son. She's a single mother. She's got a son in the military school.
Right.
She's losing her job, and without getting into all the details, she's trying to get her job back. And this columnist that he's trying to prostitute her to can help her do that. So it's really despicable. And you see it, the movie is admirable for like staying with her and staying on her face and like seeing her like break down and kind of like her like, I don't know if sadness is the most specific word I could use, but like that scene where we were really close on her face as they're standing by the bedroom door, and she's just like realizing she's going to have to go through with this.
The lighting is great, like, because the half of her face is now getting obscured in shadow. So it's he's a diabolic character.
And it's interesting how a number of the characters are using like scriptural references in a flippant or an evil way. I mean, when he leaves them together, he says, not scriptural per se, but he says, blessings on thee both or something. When JJ rebukes the senator, his friend, the senator, for being insufficiently cautious with being with his mistress in public, the senator, thanks him for good advice. He says, go thou and sin no more. But obviously it's about don't get caught. So there's a number of those kinds of things which are sort of diabolical in themselves.
That's right. And it's very telling early on when he gets on the phone. Sidney gets on the phone with one of these clients whose name has not appeared in the column in days, even though he's paid his press agent. And he accuses Sidney of lying. He says, "You're a liar," and Sidney can't dispute it. He even says, yeah, basically, and then later Sidney accuses Frank D'Angelo, who is the manager of the jazz guitarist, Steve.
And also happens to be his uncle, which is an interesting little detail.
Yeah. When he says, "I think you lied to me," I mean, his response is like very concerned and offended, And so it just sort of shows right away by way of contrasting these responses, like how comfortable he is in being a liar, in lying, and like living in a lie. And he can just turn on a dime, like all these different personas, like when he goes into the club and he's talking to Susie and Steve Dallas, and he plays at this outrage, like I'm the offended party, when Dallas is giving him the cold shoulder. All these different faces that he puts on, and even that it's one of the interesting is that like so often even like the worst face is something of a performance. Even when he's we almost never get the sense that he's being real. Yeah. Even at his worst, which is interesting. You know what I mean? Like even when he's being most nakedly bad, like when when Susie near the end threatens to kill herself and he's talking to her through her bedroom door and sort of saying all this sleazy stuff to her, there's something about that is still, it's still like, yeah, this is who I am. I'm this, hard bitten guy. But it's an act, it's a performance. Yeah.
So it's like, it's funny because like you would think like, okay, so he's pretending to be good thing. You'd think someone pretends to be good things to get ahead, but they're really bad. But he's also like pretending to be, he is bad, but he's also pretending to be bad.
Right.
It's this weird, it's like a particular bad persona that he's putting on when inside he's like nothing, I guess. Maybe that's kind of it. But he puts on this sort of, fast talking,
Right.
It's like he's trying to be JJ, or he's trying to be a character from a noir movie himself or something,
That's right. Yeah. I think that this is a commentary on that industry and like that kind of a person who's just trying to get ahead and who will wear whatever face he needs to wear for the situation, is that underneath there really isn't anything. Which is kind of terrifying. A terrifying thought on its own. But somehow, he still manages to be like pathetic, so it's not just like a horror, you know?
Yeah. There's so much to talk about with this film. I mean, Burt Lancaster is also amazing.
We should definitely mention him.
I think this might have been the first thing I ever saw him in. I'm not sure.
I think I can't recall anything either, but it's such an interesting casting choice because he is so big. He like dominates the frame whenever he's just very tall. Like he inhabits this this power, just like being himself, just standing around, you know.
Everybody was terrified of him. Like even the director was terrified of him, but he sort of like he was apparently very volatile, and like, but they sort of he just sort of used that for the character. He even had Lancaster wear his own like brow line glasses, which McKendrick described this as giving him the presence of a scholarly brute.
I know it's a very cool choice because he doesn't look like your typical mob boss or something, you know?
Right.
And it's one.
But he also doesn't look like your typical, columnist.
Yeah,
he's this big virile guy. That's more what I was thinking, is that he's this huge, square-jawed guy, and he's a columnist.
That's right. That's a good point.
That's not what Walter Winchell actually looked like.
Right.
He was like this little bald guy. But just there's so many cool things. He's so terrifying. The way he snarls, the way he toys with people, in his soft voice, and the way he like just dominates his sister like almost effortlessly, and just like doesn't allow her to speak, just interrupts her, Alexander McKendrick put Vaseline on his glasses so that he wouldn't be able to focus his eyes, and gives him this sort of like blank gaze, this like unfocused gaze.
That's so insane.
and then they shot his films from a low angle with this wide angle lens, and then overhead lighting directly above him, so that his glasses frames cast these like big weird shadows on his face, which is something that you'll notice immediately, like the shadows of his glasses. There's like very sharp,
Yeah, fascinating.
But it's a very cool.
Another nice casting choice is in the actor who plays Steve Dallas. He basically looks like the antithesis of JJ.
Right.
Just like a very sort of, he describes himself as an average Joe at one point, and it's kind of what he looks like. He looks very sort of like, an all-American young man. And then of course Susie, JJ's younger sister, she ends up being our femme fatale.
Right, that's very interesting too, because she in many ways is this helpless person and not just playing it, but she is able to actually, instead of pretending to be helpless, and then she's actually able to use her real helplessness to her advantage as well.
At the end of the film, she basically proves that what JJ said was true, that she was she was growing up, and that she was learning from him by reading his column.
She's able to manipulate this circumstance so that JJ and Sidney have this confrontation, and the truth comes out in a moment of anger that JJ was behind her boyfriend getting arrested and beaten up by this cop, and that like gives her the freedom to leave, essentially.
But she does so in with the sort of cold disaffectedness of a femme fatale.
Yes, it's very interesting when she, I know we're jumping to the end here, but it's chilling, like, because basically she's faked this message to Sidney saying JJ wants you to come to his apartment right away, and he shows up, JJ's not there, she's there. She tells him Steve's been beaten badly. She's going to throw herself off the balcony. He grabs her. She's like she's in a compromised position. She's in her nightgown. He grabs her and sort of drags her onto the bed, keeps her from jumping off the balcony. And then JJ comes in when, Sidney's standing there over the bed, and she's lying on the bed in her nightgown. And it's like, oh no, you just know that like a beat down's going to happen. And she's just silent. She like allows all of JJ's assumptions to play out. And then there's this scene where JJ is basically asking Sidney to justify himself, and Sidney's saying, she was trying to kill herself, and he's just choosing not to respond, and she's standing behind JJ, and there's this she's just staring at Falco, and she's just silent, and that's like the most chilling moment with that character.
Totally.
It's like, that she's set him up for this in some way. Of course, after that, then she pulls JJ back from continuing to beat on him.
Right. But she's like, she's gotten what she needed to get, which is like the destruction of this relationship and the, getting the information that he was behind everything that's happened to Steve.
Now, when the first couple times I saw this movie, the only criticism I would have had of it is that I would have said Susie and Steve are kind of boring characters. But I don't think that anymore. I mean, they are sort of, Steve is kind of bland, in some ways, but I think that actually works to the film's advantage to a certain degree. There's another Gary Giddens passage that I'd like to quote because it's an interesting comment on Martin Milner's performance as Steve Dallas. Giddens says, his turn and sweet smell of success is frequently criticized as dull and ineffectual, too weak to carry off one of the film's ironies. Of all the main characters, only the slandered jazz musician is consistently morally upstanding, yet Milner conveys an essential facet that a hip method actor might have missed. Dallas is more like Hunsecker than he can admit. They are both prigs, self-righteous, and combative. Susie is accustomed to being smothered, and Steve is willing to take over that task from her brother. He loses the confrontation over her because he can't leave well enough alone or get past his own ethical superiority. Dallas is a cipher and no hero. Credit Milner for getting that. So I'm curious what you think about that.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. I did think that it was odd in that confrontation how he was the one who initiated, who said, well, let's hear from Susie. Let's hear what Susie has to say. And then of course JJ picks up on that and says, okay, yeah, let's maybe she doesn't want to air it publicly, or you can speak freely, dear. And they're basically both playing the same tack, which is, well, I'm going to now use this girl as a pawn in this argument,
Yeah.
So yeah, I can't say that I thought about that very closely. I just sort of took for granted what they say about this character, which is that he's a man with integrity.
Right.
She integrity, acute, like indigestion.
Yeah, and then he says, it's a new wrinkle for me. To tell you the truth, I never thought I'd make a killing on some guy's integrity.
Yeah.
It's pretty... And he does kind of do that because what's interesting, and I think this is a little sign of Sidney's conscience, though, is that he sets it up so that, okay, he's printing this smear about him being a marijuana smoker in this guy's column and that maybe he's a communist too, and he loses his job at the nightclub. But then he's set it up as part of the plan that part of the way that JJ wins is by giving him his job back. So he's actually set it up that he gets his job back as part of the plan, and then basically he thinks because of this acute integrity, like indigestion, Steve is not going to accept this favor from JJ, and then JJ can use that to be offended and not let his sister see him anymore. But but clearly he doesn't intend to have it go any further than that. And Steve really does play into that because he totally could have been like, okay, this guy's evil and we're just gonna walk away,
right.
But instead he has to lecture the guy and tell him, what a jerk he is.
Right. Right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, what does Susie say about him? She says that he's the first real man I've ever loved.
Yeah.
And so I think that the film leans very heavily toward us, approving of these judgments and sort of taking him to be the like masculine, upright guy. In the first confrontation with Sidney, he says, like if you got something to say, like come right out and say it like a man instead of stooping around like a dog or something. But now that I think about it, it's like, this guy's totally flawed too. And I mean, I think
he is an upright guy, but I think that he has this pride and he needs to be outspoken in a way that's not helpful, And he's a young guy. He's a young guy too, though. He's not way older than her, like JJ is.
Right.
So
yeah. If anything, his manager Frank D'Angelo sort of shows us that in the way that he's willing to sort of like just take the favor and let it be. He knows that it's not going to help anything to like tell JJ to his face what they think of him. But
Right.
once everything is lost and the relationship is broken up, Frank D'Angelo is able to go up to Sidney and say, all right, you won. You got all the marbles, but it's
Yeah.
like, he's really shaming him,
Yeah.
But it's an interesting world. And it's one of the things that I also really enjoyed about this was how it takes sort of these tropes of the detective or the gangster or the lackey and imports them into this publicity, gossip, celebrity, show business world that you're not at all like familiar with or ever thinking about,
Right.
I think that's in a similar way that like say with like Double Indemnity, where we're with what is that character? He's a car insurance
He's an insurance guy, yeah.
Yeah,
Just insurance in general.
Right. So it's like, it's true that these film noir movies oftentimes are taking place in this criminal underworld with detectives and gangsters, but then sometimes it's just like publicity men and gossip columnists,
Right. Yeah. I one thing I really liked this too, we talked about, JJ and Sidney's their different performances, but the way that they work together in scenes is so great as well. I mean, we talked about the first scene when they're sitting, he's sitting slightly behind him, but then there's also the scene where they have this confrontation at the TV studio, where basically they provoke a confrontation between Steve and JJ, and there's this great scene where like it's so like almost choreographed naturally for them, where he walks over to him and and he's going on and on about if Sidney ever got anywhere near Susie, I'd take a baseball hat and break it over his head, and then Sidney raises his hand up to light the cigarette, like on cue.
Yeah.
It's like just this perfect like cronyism,
but it's like Sidney, it doesn't bother Sidney. Like Sidney almost like relishes it, he revels in sort of being who he is.
Because it's part of the performance earlier at the dinner table, when JJ says, "Match me, Sidney," and he's just crapped all over him. Sidney doesn't want to do it because he's
says,
just been genuinely insulted.
Not this time, JJ. And that's the first instance where we're given the sense that, okay, there's more between these two than meets the eye. This isn't just a one-way power thing.
Yeah. But there's so many great scenes together. Like also, the final temptation of Sidney, where after this confrontation in the TV studio, they because Steve has insulted JJ as a columnist, now JJ wants this boy taken apart because he's insulted his readers. He's insulted the predilections of, thousands of Americans and
60 million people in the greatest country of the world.
Yes. And then so he decides that he wants to take things out further on him, and Sidney doesn't want to do it, and he goes on this monologue. I never do this. I never do this. I swear on my mother's life I wouldn't do that. Not if you gave me a column would I do that. And it's like he's protested too much. He's boasted too much of how much he wouldn't do it, and he's like said the very thing that would make him do it. It's like you don't sit around with sin, boasting how great you are, and so and then just that look between them.
That's a great moment.
Been immediately caught in the trap, and then a split second later, he's sitting down with that smirk on his face again.
Do you think this is a personal thing with me? Are you telling me I think of this in terms of personal pique? Don't you see that today that boy wiped his feet on the choice and the predilections of 60 million men and women in the greatest country in the world? If you had any morals yourself, you'd understand the immorality of that boy's stand today. It wasn't me he criticized. It was my readers. Don't remove the gangplank, Sidney. You may want to get back on board.
JJ, it's one thing to wear your dog collar. When it turns into a noose, I'd rather have my freedom.
The man in jail is always for freedom.
Except if you'll excuse me, JJ, I'm not in jail.
You're in jail, Sidney. You're a prisoner of your own fears, your own greed and ambition. You're in jail.
You're blind, Mr. Magoo. This is the crossroads for me. I won't get Kello. Not for a lifetime pass to the polar grounds. Not if you serve me Cleopatra on a plate.
Sidney, I told you.
JJ, I swear to you on my mother's life, I wouldn't do that. Not if you gave me a column would I do a thing.
And who do you suppose writes the column while Susie and I are away for 3 months? The man on the moon? Thank you, Sidney. And Sidney, I'll have that piece of paper back.
One thing I'll mention in connection to our conversation last time where we talked about this like breakdown between the sexes, I don't think that that's as on display in this film because really the central relationship is between Sidney and JJ, and then I guess between JJ and his sister, which of course is a male and female relationship, but in a different way. I think that the strongest place where we get that is at the end when Susie threatens suicide, and Sidney's response is, what does he say? He says, "I've heard woman talk like this before." Yeah. And it's like,
right.
Woman talk? Like she's talking about suicide, And,
right.
and then he goes on to say, you really ought to try thinking with your head instead of with your hips. And then he says, not that I mind, women thinking with their hips. It's in their nature. But just like it's in the nature of a man to go out and hustle and get what he wants.
Yeah.
And of course, within a few moments after he says those lines, she has gotten what she wants, which
right.
is, everything, is out on the table.
Right.
And so there's like a sense where at the end that like in order for her to get free from this like oppression and this manipulation and this restraint, she has to take on the strategies, the tactics of like the men in her life.
Yeah.
She has to become like her brother so that she can get what she wants. I think that that's like a little bit of where this femme fatale character is coming from. I think it's a kind of feminist archetype where, it's having to become more like a man in this regard in this world.
But what I'm going to suggest is that, that she's doing it in a very feminine way. And I would argue that in a way, despite the hustling and getting what they want, both Sidney and JJ, you could argue, because they're not doing things like Steve based on direct confrontation. They're doing things in a sort of a much more subtle way. Maybe they're operating in a more not feminine in a good way, but maybe they're operating in more of a less of a masculine paradigm.
Sure,
themselves.
Yeah, that's interesting.
And because she's doing things, she's not doing outright confrontations. She's doing things. I don't think you can fault Susie for being, acting like a man. I don't think that everything she's doing is. I don't know. I think it's exactly what you would see, women throughout history doing to get what they want. I don't think getting what you want is a particularly masculine thing, but it's the way in which you do it, right? So I think she still is doing it in kind of a feminine way, even though there is a little bit of a ruthlessness to it, because she's dealing with these ruthless characters.
Right. Yeah. Like the suggestion.
She's not pulling out a gun and pointing it at somebody. She's using the man in her life, actually. Yeah. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
She's turning masculine energy
seems to
against
be
itself.
That's right. Yeah, it seems like the film suggests to us that she's taking her cues now from her brother or from someone like Sidney and sort of doing what they would do to arrange things such that she gets the outcome that she wants,
Right.
So it's like it's the film's own framing of these things and Sidney's framing of these things as a male or female dichotomy but yeah, I think that this was another great noir to watch. How many of these are we going to be doing? We're going to do one more?
One or two more, yeah.
Yeah. So I think that we've set a good. I mean, it's hard to follow Out of the Past, and this like definitely did.
Yeah.
And this being the second noir that we've watched on the show, it just sort of confirmed for me how much I love this genre. It's just pure like pleasure. It's just so enjoyable to watch.
But it was part of the reason that I wanted to do this is because it's not like a typical detective story,
Right.
And the same is true of Sunset Boulevard, which we'll also be watching. I wanted to mention to cite Thomas Hibbs one more time because I think it'll apply to this and Sunset Boulevard, which we'll be discussing in the future. This is early on in his book, Arts of Darkness. Subverting the rationality of the pursuit of happiness, Noir turns the American dream into a nightmare. Noir also undercuts the Enlightenment vision of the city as the locus of human bliss, wherein human autonomy and rational economics could combine to bring about the satisfaction of human desire. Instead of Enlightenment progress with its lucid sense of where we are and where we're going, Noir gives us disconcerting shadows and a present tense that is incapable of moving forward because it's overwhelmed by the past. In the Noir universe, progress and autonomy are debilitating illusions. In classic Noir, the violation of limits is rarely, if ever, successful, and whatever glimpse of redemption characters may have is always partial rather than revolutionary, and personal rather than political. The ending of many a noir and neo-noir film manages to combine physical brutality with enduring longing for communication, understanding, and even at times love. Some films suggest that even in the midst of a corrupt world, a certain kind of integrity is still possible, and that in certain circumstances, defeat can be victory. I think it's pretty clear how, the subversion of the American dream and sort of American ambition, is evidenced in this movie and what this movie is about. I mean, it's called Sweet Smell of Success, but I wanted to bring up this idea of, this sort of partial redemption or this physical brutality with, enduring longing with communication, or defeat can be victory, because I talked about this in the last movie where you often in noir films have the main character making some kind of decision of at least like partial integrity and then sort of suffering brutal consequences for it, and it being sort of too late. In this case, I think if you're looking closely, I think Sidney is not really making a decision of integrity at the end when he decides he's going to tell everything about what JJ's been up to. I think it's basically self-preservation at that point, because JJ's already called the cops on him. But you do get this scene, which is sort of like a classic noir hero being a loser ending, where he's just getting beaten down by this scary cop that we've encountered throughout the film.
Man.
Another great performance by Emil Meyer.
Yeah.
And that's sort of the second to last thing we see in the movie is just him getting beaten down, and then Susie walking off into the light of day with her victorious music. But I don't know. I'm just sort of curious. What do you think about this? Like, this sort of where do we leave Sidney here, given that he's really the main character?
Yeah, I don't know. I think
clearly got a victory for his sister, but
I think it's the same place where we leave Iago at the end of Othello.
I have to tell you, I don't know Othello, so.
Oh well, I mean, Iago is, of course, at the end of Othello, Iago has been a lot more successful in his schemes, and pretty much everybody he wanted to see die has died. But Iago has now been, by the end of the play, taken into custody, and so he's done.
Okay.
And I think that whatever happens with Sidney after the events of this film, he's done. He's not going to have the success that he thought he was going to have in this line of work. So if there's going to be any moving forward for him, it's going to have to be maybe outside of the city, definitely in another line of work, and maybe after some time spent in jail.
Right. Yeah. Well, it's great that we end this movie with like total defeat, for the two main characters by the end.
But it's nice too that we end this movie with the sun coming up. So much of the film takes place, as a noir does, at night in darkness. But one of the things I love about New York City is that time in the morning when the traffic is light and the people aren't out and it's quiet,
Yeah, it's beautifully photographed in that last shot.
It is, and it's just another little.
You do get
piece
that
of
like
the puzzle.
early morning New York City feel in the lighting there.
Yeah.
I mean, not the lighting; it's just the sun. So, were you happy? Now, you went to Cal Arts for your MFA in acting, and were you happy to watch a film by former Cal Arts Film School Dean Alexander McKendrick?
Definitely. Yeah, that was awesome. I was not surprised to hear afterward that he was apparently unique at the school in that he had a lot. He placed a much heavier emphasis on the tradition and like the disciplines of craft. I think that this is something that Cal Arts maybe at a certain point was known for. You know, it was founded by Walt Disney, and this is a man who definitely placed a premium on craft. But I think before long, Cal Arts became a very experimental place. It gained a reputation for being a very, I don't know how else to put it, but like, if you think of the art world and you think of experimental, usually, reference to the tradition and to the discipline of craft are not necessarily things that come to mind. Mm-hmm. So I thought that this film could probably only have come from someone who valued the craft of filmmaking and of storytelling and knew how to experiment within that, you know, and wasn't just sort of working from a blank slate.
So our next discussion will be with Elizabeth Lev. We're going to be talking about two movies about Michelangelo, The Agony and the Ecstasy, and a more recent film by Andrei Konchalovsky called Sin. So that'll be our next episode. And if anybody's watching on YouTube, please subscribe. If you're listening and would like to help us keep producing our podcast, you can go to catholicculture.org/donate/audio. Thanks everybody for listening, and I'll see you next time.